On the ground. Now. Hands where I can see them. The voice was rough, accustomed to command and immediate compliance. It sliced through the quiet morning air outside the Oakhaven diner, a sound as out of place as a siren in a library. The officer's hand rested on the black grip of his service weapon, a gesture that was less a threat and more a statement of fact. His name tag read Miller. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold and empty of negotiation. A few feet away, pressed against the familiar red brick of the diner wall, the man did not move. He simply stood, his posture unchanged, his breathing even. He was in his mid-50s, his face a testament to a life lived with intention, lines of thought and care etched around his eyes and mouth. He wore simple jeans and a worn leather jacket, the kind of clothes for a Saturday morning coffee run. His hands remained steady at his sides. He didn't raise them. He didn't lower them. He just was. The tension between the two men was a physical thing, a silent hum that made the half-dozen bystanders on the sidewalk freeze. Phones began to rise, small black rectangles catching the morning sun. What Officer Miller didn't know was that the man he was shoving against the brick wall of the diner wasn't just any citizen. He wasn't a suspect. He was a reckoning. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The day had begun, as it always did, in stillness. At 5:30 a.m., the only light in the house was the faint blue glow from the digital clock on the nightstand. Marcus Thorne was already awake. He had been for several minutes, lying perfectly still, listening to the quiet rhythm of his wife's breathing beside him. Elena, a pediatric surgeon, slept with the same deep peacefulness she brought to every other part of her life. He watched the slow rise and fall of her shoulders under the quilt and felt a familiar gratitude that was as essential to his morning as the coming dawn. He had learned a long time ago that these moments of quiet grace were the foundation upon which a life was built. They were the anchor in any storm. He slid out of bed without a sound, his movements fluid and practiced. 21 days of leave remaining. That was the official count. 21 days before he would walk into the 17th Precinct headquarters not as a visitor, but as the new police commissioner of the city of Northwood. The appointment was the culmination of a 30-year career that had taken him from the JAG Corps in the deserts of Iraq to the federal prosecutor's office in Washington, D.C. Now, he was coming home. Back to the city where his father had run a small hardware store and his mother had taught second grade. Back to the streets he knew not as beats or sectors, but as the geography of his own childhood. In the kitchen, he started the coffee, the rich smell of dark roast filling the air. It was a sensory grounding, a ritual. The light outside was just beginning to shift from the deep indigo of pre-dawn to a soft, hazy gray. He watched the change through the large window over the sink that looked out onto their small, meticulously kept garden. Elena's garden. Another piece of her piece. He measured his breaths. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 6. It was a habit learned in places where chaos was the norm and discipline was the only thing that kept you alive. It served him just as well now. He let himself feel the weight of the coming responsibility for exactly 90 seconds. The weight of the city's hope, the department's resistance, the mayor's political gamble. Then he let it go. It was a job. He knew how to do the job. After his coffee, he went to the garage. It was his sanctuary. In the center of the clean, organized space sat a 1968 Ford Mustang, its Highland green paint gleaming even in the dim light. His father had bought it for him piece by piece, a high school graduation present assembled over 2 years of weekend work. It wasn't just a car. It was a promise, a symbol of freedom, of the open road, of the idea that you could get from here to there on your own power. He ran a hand over the cool metal of the hood. The car smelled of leather and gasoline and time. It was the smell of his own history. He started the engine. The low, rumbling growl was a satisfying sound, a deep-throated declaration of presence. He backed out of the driveway slowly, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. He didn't need anyone to tell him what this transition meant. He was leaving a world of federal statutes and carefully worded indictments for a world of street-level friction, of split-second decisions, and their lifelong consequences. The machine, as his predecessor at the U.S. Attorney's Office used to call it. He was being brought in to fix a part of that machine that was badly broken. The city's police department was rife with accusations of excessive force, biased policing, and a culture of impunity. His appointment by the new, reform-minded mayor, Isabella Rossi, was a clear signal. Change was coming. He drove through the quiet suburban streets as the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting long shadows and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He wasn't heading toward the city center, toward the gleaming towers of power. He was heading for the Oakhaven district, the neighborhood he grew up in. The diner on the corner of Elm and 3rd was still there, now run by the daughter of the man who used to give him free cherry cokes when he was a kid. Mrs. Peterson. She was an elder of the community, a woman who had seen it all from behind her simple Formica countertop. Her coffee was strong, and her wisdom was stronger. He parked the Mustang in its usual spot across the street. As he got out, he noticed a city patrol car parked a half-block down. It was idly parked, engine running. He didn't think much of it. Cops needed coffee too. He felt the familiar weight of his keys in his pocket, the cool metal of his father's old St. Christopher medal on the same ring. He crossed the street, the morning air cool on his face. Just the road and the engine and the morning air. Simple. Final. He was just a man named Marcus, going for a cup of coffee on a Saturday morning. 21 days of leave remaining. The thought was a quiet hum beneath the surface of the day. A countdown. He pushed open the glass door of the Oakhaven diner, a small bell announcing his arrival, and stepped inside. The warmth and the smell of frying bacon and coffee enveloped him like a hug. It was a place of normalcy, a relic of a simpler time. But outside, in the patrol car, a pair of eyes watched him, and the machine was beginning to grind. The inside of the Oakhaven diner was a time capsule. Red vinyl booths, a long Formica counter with spinning stools, and the clatter of ceramic mugs against saucers. It was the sound of community. Marcus took a seat at the counter, on the 3rd stool from the end, his usual spot. Mrs. Peterson, a woman whose age was impossible to guess and whose eyes missed nothing, was already turning from the grill with a heavy white mug in her hand. Morning, Marcus. Her voice was warm, but carried a hint of gravel from a lifetime of calling out orders. The usual? Morning, Clara. Yes, ma'am. The usual. She placed the mug in front of him and filled it with steaming black coffee. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of decades spent in this narrow space. She knew the rhythms of this place, the stories of the people who passed through it. She was the neighborhood's memory. Heard the news, she said, her back to him as she flipped a row of pancakes. She didn't need to elaborate. In Oakhaven, news like that traveled faster than any newspaper delivery. Big job. City Hall is a long way from Elm Street. It's not so far, Marcus said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. The problems are the same, just bigger. She turned, leaning against the stainless steel counter. Her gaze was direct. You be careful, Marcus. That chair you're about to sit in. It's got a lot of ghosts. Some of them are still walking around in uniform. That was the first thing people who knew him said. Not congratulations, but be careful. They knew the landscape. They knew the nature of the fight he was walking into. He had learned a long time ago that the most profound wisdom often came from people who had spent their lives watching the world from a fixed position, like a lighthouse keeper. Clara Peterson was a lighthouse. I know, he said simply. He took a sip of his coffee. It was perfect. Strong, hot, no nonsense. Just like the woman who made it. They talked for a few more minutes about small things. Her grandson's college applications. The leaking roof on the community center. The upcoming city council vote on zoning. It was the easy, familiar talk of people who shared a history. While they spoke, Marcus noticed the patrol car again through the diner's large front window. It had moved closer, now parked directly across the street. The officer inside was just sitting there, watching the diner. Watching him. It was a subtle thing, but Marcus's instincts, honed by years as a prosecutor and before that as a military officer, registered it. It wasn't the relaxed posture of a cop on a coffee break. It was the focused stillness of observation. He finished his coffee and placed a $10 bill on the counter. Keep the change, Clara. You don't have to do that. I know, he smiled. For the roof. He stood up to leave. As he did, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, amber prescription bottle. He looked at the label. It was his father's heart medication. He'd picked it up from the pharmacy the day before and had forgotten to drop it by his father's house. He made a mental note to do it after this. He unscrewed the cap, shook one small white pill into his palm, and dry swallowed it. An aspirin, a habit he'd picked up for his own heart health on the advice of his doctor. He screwed the cap back on the bottle, his father's name, John Thorne, clearly visible on the label, and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He nodded a final goodbye to Clara and pushed the door open, the little bell chiming his exit. The morning was brighter now, the sun fully clear of the buildings. The air was still cool. He took a deep breath, appreciating the simple peace of it. He started across the street toward his Mustang. He had taken maybe 5 steps off the curb when he heard the car door slam. "Hey, you. Stop right there." The voice was the same one from the patrol car. Officer Miller. He was out of his vehicle now, standing tall in the street, his hand already resting on his holstered weapon. His stance was aggressive, a challenge. Marcus stopped. He turned slowly, his hands held open and away from his body. A learned reflex. Make no sudden moves. Be a non-threat. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked. His voice was calm, measured. The officer, Miller, strode toward him, closing the distance with an unnerving speed. He was younger than Marcus, maybe in his late 30s, with a blocky build and a face that seemed permanently set in a look of impatient disdain. He stopped a few feet from Marcus, his eyes scanning him from head to toe. The kind of look that wasn't meant to assess, but to diminish. "I saw that," Miller said, his voice loud, performative. "For the benefit of anyone watching. What was that you just put in your pocket?" "I'm not sure I understand," Marcus said, keeping his tone even. "Don't play dumb with me," Miller snapped. "The little bottle. The transaction. I saw it." "Transaction?" Marcus felt a cold knot begin to form in his stomach. Not from fear. From a deep, weary anger. He knew the script. He had prosecuted cases that started this way. A manufactured pretense. An abuse of authority dressed up as suspicion. "Officer, I was just in the diner having coffee," Marcus explained, his voice still a model of composure. "The only thing I put in my pocket was a bottle of my father's prescription medication." Miller smirked. It was a small, ugly motion of his mouth. "Right. Medication, let me see it." It wasn't a request. It was an order. "I don't believe I'm required to do that," Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more precise. "You have no reasonable suspicion of a crime." That was the moment the air changed. The legal phrase, spoken so calmly, seemed to infuriate the officer. Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of rage at being challenged. His authority questioned by this man in jeans and an old jacket who dared to know the law. "Reasonable suspicion?" Miller's voice dripped with contempt. "I got all the suspicion I need. You fit the description." "The description of what?" Marcus asked, his gaze unwavering. Miller didn't answer. He took another step forward, crowding Marcus's personal space. "The behavioral signature. Physical intimidation. We've had reports of drug activity in this area. A man matching your description. Now, show me what's in your pocket, or I'm going to take it from you." From inside the diner, Marcus could see Clara Peterson's face, her expression tight with worry. On the sidewalk, a young woman with a messenger bag had her phone up, pointed directly at them. The witness. Marcus made a slow, deliberate movement, turning his body slightly to ensure the girl and her phone had a clear view of the interaction. He was no longer just a man having coffee. He was evidence. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are making a serious mistake. That wasn't a threat. Something colder than a threat. It was a statement of inevitable consequence." But Miller didn't hear it that way. He heard only defiance. And in his world, defiance from a man who looked like Marcus Thorne, in a neighborhood like Oakhaven, required a singular response. "You're done talking," Miller snarled. He reached out and shoved Marcus hard in the chest. "I said on the ground." Now, the shove was jarring. It sent Marcus stumbling back a step, his balance momentarily lost. He caught himself against the cool brick of the diner wall. The rough texture scraped against the back of his hand. He felt a sharp, immediate sting of pain, but his face remained a mask of calm. He looked down at his hand, at the bright red line welling up with blood, then back up at the officer. He didn't say a word. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. A small eternity filled with the officer's heavy breathing and the distant sound of city traffic. "You're resisting," Miller said, his voice rising in pitch, a clear sign he was escalating for the record, for the audience of bystanders, and for any body camera that might be recording. You are resisting arrest. You haven't told me what I'm being arrested for, officer, Marcus stated, the words clear and distinct. He was building a record of his own. Verbal. Precise. Miller's face flushed with anger. The calm, logical resistance was something his power could not immediately crush, and it enraged him. He was used to fear, to panic compliance, to shouted arguments he could easily win by being the loudest man with a gun. This quiet, unshakable composure was a language he didn't understand. So he resorted to the only one he did. He lunged forward. It was not the controlled movement of a trained officer making a safe arrest. It was a tackle. His shoulder drove into Marcus's chest, slamming him back against the brick wall with a sickening thud. The impact knocked the wind out of Marcus. For a split second, the world went fuzzy, black spots dancing in his vision. He felt the officer's weight pressing him into the wall, one forearm pressed hard against his throat. He could feel the man spit as he yelled, his face inches from Marcus's. I gave you an order. You think you're better than me? Marcus didn't struggle. He didn't fight back. He went limp, letting his training take over. To resist physically was to invite more violence, to give them the justification they were looking for. He let his body absorb the impact, his mind racing, cataloging every detail. The pressure on his neck, the smell of stale coffee on the officer's breath, the scrape of the badge on Miller's uniform against his jacket, the faces of the people watching, a mix of horror and fear. The young woman with the phone, her hand shaking but holding steady. Hands behind your back, Miller yelled, pulling Marcus away from the wall and spinning him around with brutal force. He wrenched Marcus's arms behind him, the motion sharp and painful, designed to inflict pain. Marcus felt a sharp tear in his shoulder, a familiar, sickening pop. He gritted his teeth, his breath hissing out. He complied. He put his hands behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. Miller cinched them down tight, far too tight. The metal cut into his skin, immediately cutting off circulation. Marcus could feel his fingers starting to tingle and go numb. What's your name? Miller demanded, his knee pressed into the back of Marcus's legs. You have me at a disadvantage, officer, Marcus said, his voice strained from the pressure on his chest. You haven't identified yourself. It's Officer Miller, he spat, as if the name itself were an insult. And you're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance and resisting arrest. He roughly patted Marcus down, his hands clumsy and invasive. He reached into the jacket pocket and pulled out the prescription bottle. He held it up triumphantly, like a trophy. Uh-huh. What do we have here? He squinted at the label. For a moment, he was silent. The name on the bottle, John Thorne, and the name of the medication, lisinopril, were clearly visible. A common blood pressure medication, not a controlled substance. Not by any stretch of the imagination. The triumphant look on Miller's face faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then annoyance. His pretense had just evaporated in his hand. But he had already committed. He had used force. He had made an arrest. To back down now would be to admit he was wrong. And Officer Miller did not admit he was wrong. Could be anything in here, he muttered, shaking the bottle. We'll test it downtown. He shoved the bottle into his own pocket. Just then, a second patrol car screeched to a halt behind Miller's. A sergeant got out of the passenger side. He was older than Miller, with a thick mustache and a weary look in his eyes. His name tag read Davis. He was the mid-level protector, the supervisor called to manage the scene, which meant managing the narrative. What V we got, Miller? Davis asked, his eyes taking in the scene. Marcus in cuffs, the small crowd, the phone still recording. Got a suspect here, Sarge, Miller said, his voice full of self-importance. Observed him in a suspected narcotics transaction. He resisted. I had to take him down. A neat and tidy lie. A story for the report. Davis walked over to Marcus. He didn't look at him with Miller's overt hostility, but with something almost worse, a tired, dismissive paternalism. The look of a man who just wanted the problem to go away. All right, son, let's calm down, Davis said, his voice deceptively gentle. We can sort this all out. Just cooperate, and we'll get you on your way. Marcus looked at the sergeant. He saw the whole system in the man's tired eyes. The willingness to look the other way, to smooth over the rough edges of a subordinate's misconduct, to protect the blue line above all else. The machine. Sergeant, Marcus said, his voice still steady despite the pain in his shoulder and the numbness in his hands. Your officer assaulted me. He arrested me under a false pretense. I have complied physically at every turn. I would like to speak to my lawyer. Davis's face hardened. The request for a lawyer. The formal assertion of rights. This was not the frightened, compliant suspect he had hoped for. This complicated things. Look, Davis said, his tone shifting. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We can do this here, or we can do it downtown. Your choice. But right now, you're going in the back of my car. He and Miller each took one of Marcus's arms and began to march him toward the second patrol car. The humiliation was profound. The feeling of being frog-marched down a street he had played on as a child, treated like a criminal in front of people who had known him his whole life. He could see Clara Peterson standing in the doorway of her diner, her face a mask of cold fury. He saw the young woman with the phone, her expression grim. He let himself feel the shame, the rage, for exactly 10 seconds. He counted the breaths. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 6. Then he stored it away. Emotion was a luxury he could not afford right now. Now was for observation. For memory. For the record. They pushed him toward the open rear door of the cruiser. Miller pushed his head down roughly. Watch your head, he said, the words a mockery of politeness. As Marcus bent to get into the car, the world seemed to slow down. He noted the peeling paint on the door frame, the lingering smell of stale cigarette smoke in the back seat, the thick plexiglass divider separating him from the front. This was a place of powerlessness, a cage. And then, a new sound cut through the tension. The sound of a powerful, quiet engine and the crunch of tires pulling up to the curb. It wasn't a patrol car. It was a large, black SUV, the kind favored by government officials. The windows were tinted. It pulled to a stop just behind Sergeant Davis's car, blocking them in. Miller and Davis paused, annoyed by the interruption. Who the hell is this? Miller muttered. The driver's side door of the SUV opened. A woman in a sharply tailored blue suit stepped out. She had dark hair pulled back in a neat chignon and an air of authority that was not performed, but innate. She closed the door with a solid, definitive thud. It was Mayor Isabella Rossi. She surveyed the scene with a quick, intelligent gaze. She saw the two officers holding Marcus. She saw the handcuffs. She saw the crowd. Her face, usually warm and expressive in public, became a mask of cold, controlled fury. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She walked toward them with a deliberate, unhurried pace. The officers stared, momentarily stunned into silence. This was not part of their script. The mayor did not just show up to routine arrests in Oak Haven. Mayor Rossi stopped a few feet away. She ignored Officer Miller and Sergeant Davis completely. Her eyes were fixed on Marcus, who was still bent over, halfway into the police car. Marcus, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the morning air. I see you're getting an early start on community outreach. Miller and Davis exchanged a confused look. Marcus slowly straightened up, as much as the officer's grip would allow. He looked at the mayor, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than pure composure crossed his face. It was a deep, profound weariness. The mayor's eyes moved from Marcus's face to the tight handcuffs on his wrists, to the raw scrape on the back of his hand. Her expression grew colder. She turned her gaze, finally, to Sergeant Davis. Sergeant, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. Would you mind explaining to me why you have the next police commissioner of this city in handcuffs? The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the sound in the world had been sucked into a vacuum. The traffic, the murmuring crowd, the birds in the trees, everything went quiet. Officer Miller's face went slack, the color draining from it. He looked from the mayor to Marcus and back again. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he had walked off a cliff and was suspended in midair, with 1,000-foot drop below him. Sergeant Davis swallowed hard. His weary, paternalistic demeanor vanished, replaced by a raw, naked panic. Ma'am, Mayor, there's been a misunderstanding. The mayor took a step closer. Her eyes were like chips of ice. A misunderstanding? It looks to me like 2 of your officers have assaulted and illegally detained a citizen without cause. A citizen who, in 20 days, will be their commanding officer. So you'll forgive me if I don't see this as a misunderstanding, I see this as a symptom of the very disease he was appointed to cure. She looked back at Marcus. Her voice softened, but only slightly. Morning, Commissioner. The title, spoken aloud, landed with the force of a physical blow. Commissioner. It echoed in the quiet street. Miller's hand, which had been gripping Marcus's arm, fell away as if he'd been burned. Davis let go, too, taking a half-step back. They looked at Marcus Thorne, the man in the worn jacket they had just slammed against a wall, as if seeing him for the first time. They didn't see a suspect anymore. They saw the end of their careers. Get the keys, the mayor commanded, her voice like steel. Take the cuffs off him. Now. Davis fumbled at his belt, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unclip his key ring. He moved toward Marcus, his eyes wide with fear. Sir, I am so sorry. Marcus just looked at him. He didn't say a word. He held out his cuffed hands. The silence was more damning than any accusation. Davis struggled with the lock, his fingers clumsy. The first cuff clicked open. Then the second. Marcus brought his hands around to his front, slowly, deliberately. He rubbed his wrists, his face impassive as he looked at the deep, red welts the metal had left behind. He flexed his numb fingers, trying to bring the feeling back. The mayor's driver, a large man in a dark suit, had gotten out of the SUV and was now standing nearby, a silent, imposing presence. Chief Reynolds is on his way, the mayor said to Marcus. I called him the second I saw this. Marcus nodded slowly. Chief Reynolds. The outgoing chief. The man who represented everything Marcus was meant to change. The systemic enabler. Thank you, Isabella, Marcus said, his voice quiet. He looked past the shell-shocked officers to the sidewalk. He saw the young woman, who was still recording, her face a mixture of shock and vindication. He caught her eye. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he looked at Clara Peterson, who was now walking toward them from the diner, her face a thundercloud. Are you all right, Marcus? Clara asked, her voice trembling with rage. She looked at Miller and Davis with pure contempt. I saw the whole thing. The whole damn thing. I'm all right, Clara, Marcus said. He walked over to the young woman with the phone. What's your name? Sarah, she said, her voice a little shaky. Sarah Jenkins. I'm a journalism student at Northwood State. Sarah, Marcus said, his voice low and calm. You have a video of this entire incident. Yes, sir. From the moment he first shouted at you. Good. Marcus looked her directly in the eye. I need you to do something for me. Don't post it. Don't send it to anyone. Just hold on to it. Keep it safe. Can you do that for me? Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the request. Yes, sir. I can. Thank you. He was protecting the integrity of the evidence. A prosecutor's instinct. He then turned back to face Miller and Davis, who were standing frozen, like statues in a museum of terrible mistakes. The reckoning had not even begun, but they were already its first exhibits. 20 days of leave remaining. The countdown had just been reset. This was no longer a vacation. It was a prelude to war. A war Marcus Thorne had no intention of losing. A few minutes later, another car, this one an unmarked sedan, pulled up hastily. A man in his late 50s, with a florid face and thinning gray hair, got out. He wore a rumpled suit and a panicked expression. This was Chief Frank Reynolds, a man 20 days from a comfortable retirement. A retirement that was now in serious jeopardy. He rushed over, his eyes darting between the mayor, Marcus, and his two disgraced officers. Mayor, what's going on? I came as soon as I got your call. Mayor Rossi didn't even look at him. She kept her focus on Marcus. Commissioner Thorne was just giving me a demonstration of your department's community policing standards, Chief. I have to say, I'm not impressed. Reynolds's face went from panicked to ghostly white. He finally looked, truly looked, at Marcus, at the scraped hand, the bruised wrists, the torn shoulder of his jacket. He turned on Miller and Davis, his voice a harsh whisper. What did you do? Miller and Davis stood mute, their careers flashing before their eyes. Marcus finally spoke, his voice void of emotion. Chief Reynolds, your officers profiled me, assaulted me, and arrested me on a fabricated charge. They did so in full view of the public. I believe the term for this is business as usual. Each word was a precisely placed stone, building a wall that Reynolds knew he could not climb. He had two choices: defend his men and be destroyed with them, or cut them loose and try to save himself. He chose the latter without a moment's hesitation. Miller. Davis. My office. Now, he barked. You're on desk duty until further notice. Hand over your weapons. He was trying to look like he was in control, but the desperation was plain to see. The mayor stepped in. That won't be necessary, Frank. They won't be in the office. They're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Their guns and badges will be surrendered to Internal Affairs, who I expect to open a full investigation before noon today. An investigation that you will not be a part of. The finality in her voice was absolute. She was cutting him out of the loop, severing his power before he could use it to protect his men or himself. Marcus watched the exchange. This was the machine in panic mode, its gears grinding, trying to isolate and eject the broken parts to save the whole. But he wasn't interested in just replacing a few broken cogs. He was here to redesign the entire engine. He walked over to his Mustang. He leaned against the driver's side door, the cool metal of familiar comfort. He took a deep breath. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and the pain in his shoulder was blooming, a deep, throbbing ache. He looked at the scene. The mayor, calm and in command. The disgraced chief, sputtering and irrelevant. The two officers, their faces blank with shock. And the community, watching. Clara, Sarah, a dozen others. His community. They were the reason he was here. Marcus, the mayor said, walking over to him. Let's get you home. Elena needs to see you're okay. He shook his head. Not yet. I need to make a stop. He pushed himself off the car and walked back to where Miller and Davis stood, waiting for their fate. He stopped in front of Officer Miller. The man flinched. Officer, Marcus said, his voice quiet. The bottle you took from my pocket. I'd like it back. Miller looked confused, then remembered the prescription bottle he'd shoved into his own pocket as evidence. He fumbled for it, his hands shaking, and held it out to Marcus. Marcus took it. This is for my father's heart condition, Marcus said, holding the bottle so Miller could see the label clearly. His name is John Thorne. He's 78 years old. He ran a hardware store on this very street for 40 years. Most people here just call him Pops. You should remember that name. You'll be seeing it again. On a federal lawsuit for civil rights violations. He pocketed the bottle and walked away without another word. He got into his Mustang, the familiar scent of leather and history a welcome comfort. He started the engine, the low rumble a sound of defiance. He put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the wreckage of 3 careers and a broken system in his rearview mirror. He had 20 days of leave left. He was going to use every single minute. The counterattack had already begun. The drive home was quiet. Marcus focused on the road, on the physical act of driving. The feel of the steering wheel in his hands, the hum of the engine, the blur of the houses passing by. He was compartmentalizing. It was a skill he had perfected over a lifetime of navigating hostile environments. First, you survive the immediate threat. Then, you assess the damage. Then, you plan the response. He was now in phase 2. He pulled into his driveway and killed the engine. The silence in the garage was profound. He sat for a long moment, his hands resting on the wheel. He let himself feel it. The humiliation, the searing anger, the deep, aching pain in his shoulder. He gave himself exactly 5 minutes. He watched the second hand on his watch sweep around the dial 5 times. A measured dose of emotion. When the 5 minutes were up, he took a deep breath. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 6. The feeling was still there, a hot coal in his chest, but it was no longer in control. It was fuel. He walked into the house. Elena was in the kitchen, a medical journal open on the table, a half-empty cup of tea beside it. She looked up as he entered, her brow furrowed with worry. The mayor had called her. She stood up and came to him without a word. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She was a doctor. She saw the signs. The way he held his left arm stiffly against his body. The raw, red marks on his wrists. The faint tremor in his hands. She gently took his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. Her touch was an anchor. "Let me see your shoulder," she said, her voice calm and professional, but laced with a deep, personal concern. He let her guide him to a chair. He took off his jacket, wincing as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through him. The fabric of his shirt was torn at the shoulder seam. Elena's expression tightened as she carefully examined the joint, her fingers gentle but sure. "It's a dislocation," she said, her diagnosis swift and certain. Probably a slight tear in the rotator cuff. Marcus, this needs an X-ray. We need to go to the hospital. No, he said, his voice firm. No hospitals. No official reports. Not yet. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She understood immediately. An official medical report would become part of the narrative, something the police union and the chief's office could spin, could use. He needed to control the story. I can reduce it here, she said. But it's going to hurt. I know, he said. Do it. He trusted her completely. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, preparing himself. He focused on his breathing. Elena positioned herself, her hands finding the exact right points on his arm and shoulder. On 3, she said. 1, 2 inch on 3, she applied a swift, precise pressure. The pain was a blinding white flash. A guttural sound escaped his lips. His entire body tensed. Then came a sickening, audible pop as the joint slid back into its socket. The intense, sharp pain immediately subsided into a deep, throbbing ache. He slumped in the chair, sweat beading on his forehead. Elena was already moving, getting a sling from their first aid kit, a bag of frozen peas from the freezer. She worked in silence, her movements efficient and filled with a quiet, focused anger on his behalf. She wrapped the peas in a dish towel and gently placed them on his shoulder. She helped him into the sling. They did this to you, she said, her voice a low murmur. On the street, in front of your home. It's what they do, Elena, he said, his voice weary. The only difference is this time, they did it to the wrong man. She finished her work and then sat in the chair opposite him. She took his uninjured hand. What are you going to do? The mayor wants a quick, clean amputation, he said. Fire the 2 officers, force Reynolds into retirement, issue a press release, and move on. That's the political solution. But that's not your solution, she stated. It wasn't a question. No, that's just cutting off a few diseased branches. The roots are still in the ground. The whole tree is sick. He looked at her, his eyes hard. Miller and Davis aren't the problem. They're a symptom. The problem is the system that created them, trained them, and protected them. The system that taught Miller that he could assault a man in broad daylight for no reason, and his supervisor would help him write the report to justify it. The system that Chief Reynolds has allowed to fester for 20 years. He paused, the weight of the words filling the quiet kitchen. I'm not going to just punish them. I'm going to use them. I'm going to pull on this one thread, and I'm going to unravel the entire rotten tapestry. How? She asked. I have 20 days of leave, he said. A small, grim smile touched his lips. I'm a federal prosecutor on paid vacation. I have a victim, an assault, a false arrest, and a conspiracy to cover it up. I have a video. I have eyewitnesses. I have a mountain of probable cause. So I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to build a case. Not just against Miller and Davis. Against the whole damn machine. He spent the rest of the day on the phone. His first call was to Mayor Rossi. Marcus, I'm so sorry, she began. I've already spoken to the city attorney. We're prepared to move on termination proceedings for both officers immediately. Isabella, slow down, Marcus said, his voice calm. I appreciate the impulse, but that's not what we're going to do. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean? Firing them is easy, Marcus explained. It's a public relations win, but it doesn't solve anything. They'll get union lawyers, appeal the decision, and in a year they'll either be back on the force with back pay, or they'll get a quiet settlement and go be cops in the next county. The system that produced them remains untouched. So what do you propose? The mayor asked, her voice cautious. I want you to hold off on the terminations. Let the IA investigation proceed, but I want it done by the book, slow and methodical. I want Miller and Davis to think they have a chance. I want them to talk. I want them to coordinate their stories with their union reps. I want them to build their own gallows. And while they're doing that, Marcus said, I'm going to be conducting my own investigation. Quietly. Off the books. I'm going to use my remaining leave to look into every complaint ever filed against those 2 officers. Every use of force report. Every case they've ever been a witness and that got thrown out. I'm going to look at Sergeant Davis's record as a supervisor. Who he protected, what he buried. And I'm going to look at every single one of those cases that crossed Chief Reynolds' desk. The mayor was silent for a long moment. He could hear her thinking, calculating the political risk. This was not the clean, quick victory she had envisioned. This was messy. This was a war. "This is dangerous, Marcus," she said finally. "You'll be going up against the entire police union. Reynolds still has loyalists all through the department. They will see this as a declaration of war." "It is a declaration of war," Marcus replied, his voice flat. "They declared it this morning, outside the Oakhaven diner. I'm just responding in kind. The difference is, I'm going to win. I need your help, Isabella. I need access. I need you to run interference and keep Reynolds and his people out of my way." He could hear the resolve in her voice when she finally answered. "What do you need?" "To start," he said, "I need an unredacted copy of every personnel file, complaint, and use of force report for Officer Miller and Sergeant Davis for their entire careers. And I want the same for every officer Davis has supervised in the last 5 years. That's a mountain of data, Marcus. I know. I've got 20 days. The rest of the weekend was a blur of quiet activity. The mayor, true to her word, had a courier deliver 3 large, sealed boxes to his house on Sunday afternoon. They were filled with files. The box of evidence, version 10. Marcus and Elena converted their dining room into a war room. They spread the files out on the large wooden table. It was a sea of paper, a documented history of casual violence and forgotten victims. As Marcus began to sift through the files, a pattern quickly emerged. Officer Miller was a bully with a badge. His file was thick with citizen complaints for verbal abuse, illegal searches, and excessive force. At least a dozen in his 8-year career. Every single one of them had been dismissed. Unfounded, exonerated, subject was non-compliant, the justifications were boilerplate, apathetic. And on every single dismissal form, there was a second signature, right below Miller's. Sergeant Davis. The protector. But as Marcus dug deeper, he knew this was only part of the story. These were just the official complaints, the ones that had made it through the department's intentionally cumbersome process. He knew that for every official complaint, there were 10 more incidents that were never reported. People who were too scared, too tired, or too convinced that it wouldn't make a difference. To get to the real truth, he needed to go back to the source. He needed to go back to Oakhaven. On Monday morning, his arm in a sling beneath a loose-fitting sweater, he drove the Mustang back to the corner of Elm and 3rd. He parked in the same spot. He didn't go into the diner right away. He just sat in his car, watching. The street was back to normal. The yellow police tape was gone. People were going about their business. But something had changed. The air was different. People looked at the spot where he had been arrested, then looked away. The incident was a ghost that now haunted the corner. He got out of the car and walked into the diner. The bell chimed. Every head in the place turned. The conversation stopped. Then, an old man sitting at the counter raised his coffee mug. "Morning, Commissioner," he said, his voice loud and clear. Then another person nodded. And another. It was a quiet, powerful show of support. Marcus nodded back to them, a lump forming in his throat. He walked to the counter and sat down. Clara Peterson was there, her face set in grim lines. "I was hoping you'd come back," she said. She slid a mug of coffee in front of him. "They can't be allowed to get away with it, Marcus. Not again." "They won't, Clara," he said. "I need your help." "Anything," she said without hesitation. "You've been on this corner for 30 years, he said. "You've seen it all. Officer Miller, Sergeant Davis." This wasn't the first time. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "The first time today, maybe." She wiped down the counter with a cloth, her movements slow and deliberate. "That Miller, he's got a mean streak. Thinks the badge gives him the right to be judge and jury. And Davis just cleans up his messes. They've been working this neighborhood for years. A team. People file complaints," Marcus prompted gently. "And the complaints go into a black hole," she said, her voice laced with cynicism. "I've seen people try. They go down to the precinct, fill out the forms. A few weeks later, they get a letter. Investigation complete. No wrongdoing found. It's a machine, Marcus. It's designed to wear you down until you give up, the machine metaphor." He'd heard it before. "I know," Marcus said. "But what about the ones who didn't give up? What about the ones who wrote things down for themselves?" Clara stopped wiping the counter. She looked at him, her eyes sharp. She seemed to be making a decision. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "Finish your coffee," she said. "Then come with me." She led him from the diner, through the kitchen, and into a small, cluttered office in the back. The room smelled of old paper and dust. It was the diner's nerve center, but it was also something more. She walked over to a large, metal filing cabinet in the corner. It was old and dented, but the lock on it was new and heavy-duty. She unlocked it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. She pulled open the bottom drawer. It was packed with folders. Manila folders, each one neatly labeled with a name and a date. "My father started it," Clara said, her voice soft. "Back in the 60s. Every time he saw something, every time a customer came in here crying or angry because of how they were treated by the police, he'd write it down. He'd get them to write it down, too. A notarized statement, if he could. He said you can't fight ghosts. You need paper. You need a record." She pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Marcus. The label read Miller, D. "When I took over the diner, I kept it going," she said. "This is Miller's file. And there's one for Davis, too." Marcus opened the folder. It was the box of evidence. A treasure trove of meticulously documented injustice. There were handwritten statements, dated and signed. There were photographs of bruises and damaged property. There were copies of the official complaint forms, and next to them, the dismissal letters from the department. There were dates, times, badge numbers, witness names. A pattern of abuse stretching back years, all centered on this one neighborhood, all perpetrated by the same handful of officers, and all systematically ignored by the department. He saw a statement from a young man who was pulled over by Miller for a broken taillight that wasn't broken, and then had his car illegally searched. A statement from a woman who had been verbally abused by Miller when she tried to ask for directions. A statement from a shop owner whose son had been roughed up for loitering in front of his own father's store. Each story was a small cut, a minor injustice on its own. But together, they formed a portrait of a predator who used his badge as a weapon and a system that looked the other way. "Clara," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. This is everything." "I know," she said quietly. "I've been waiting for someone who knew what to do with it." As Marcus was looking through the files, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Is this Marcus Thorne?" a voice asked. It was a young man's voice, hesitant. "It is. To whom am I speaking?" "My name is Detective Chun. I work in the 17th Precinct. In the robbery division." There was a pause. "Sir, Commissioner, I heard what happened. I think I can help. The insider. The ally from within the corrupt institution." The final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. "I'm listening, Detective," Marcus said, a new wave of resolve hardening his voice. He had the official records. He had the community's shadow archive. And now, he had a source on the inside. The machine was about to have a very bad day. Detective Michael Chun was young, maybe 30, with the keen, restless eyes of a man who saw more than he was supposed to. He had asked to meet in a neutral location, a small park on the other side of town, far from the prying eyes of the 17th Precinct. Marcus sat on a bench, the box of Clara Peterson's files on the seat beside him. It felt heavy, filled with the weight of years of silent anger. Chun approached cautiously, scanning the park before sitting on the other end of the bench. He was in civilian clothes, a nondescript hoodie and jeans. He looked more like a grad student than a cop. "Commissioner Thorne," he began, his voice low. "Thank you for meeting me. Taking this call was a risk for me." "I appreciate it, Detective," Marcus said. "What did you want to tell me?" "I've been on the job for 6 years," Chun said, looking down at his hands. "I came on because I wanted to make a difference. I grew up in this city. I believed in the mission. But it didn't take long to see how things really work, especially with guys like Miller and supervisors like Davis." He looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "What happened to you on Saturday? That wasn't an isolated incident. That's Miller's MO. He targets people he thinks are powerless. He manufactures probable cause. He escalates to force because he likes the feeling. And Davis signs off on it. Every time. He calls it proactive policing, the rest of us call it shaking down the neighborhood." "I've seen the complaint files," Marcus said, gesturing to the box. "They're extensive." "The paper files are just the tip of the iceberg," Chun said, shaking his head. "What you need to see is the digital trail. The body cam footage. I assume Miller's camera was malfunctioning on Saturday," Marcus said dryly. Chun smirked. "Of course it was. Convenient, right? But he's not always that smart. And Davis is lazy. They're required to log every traffic stop, every street encounter, in the department's database. Most of the time, they write a generic report. But the body cam footage is uploaded automatically. It's supposed to be tagged to the report. Davis is supposed to review all of his officers' use of force footage. But he doesn't. He just copy-pastes the same sentence into the review field. Action consistent with department policy, he does it dozens of times a month. He probably hasn't actually watched a video in years. This was it. The systemic failure. The proof of deliberate negligence. But the footage is still there? Marcus asked, his heart rate quickening. It's on the server, Chen confirmed. For a limited time. It gets purged after a certain period unless it's flagged for an IA case or a criminal trial. Hundreds of hours of footage. Miller pulling people over for no reason. Miller searching cars without consent. Miller getting aggressive with people who talk back to him. It's all there. And on every single one, the supervisory review from Sergeant Davis is a rubber stamp. How do I get access to that server? Marcus asked. You don't, Chen said. Not officially. Not without Reynolds knowing. But the system is old. The IT security is a joke. I have a friend in the tech division. He's like me. He's been waiting for a change in leadership. He owes me a favor. He can make a copy of Miller's and Davis's entire digital history. Every report, every video, every internal message. But he can only do it once. And if he gets caught, he's fired. And probably charged with a crime. Tell your friend I will not let that happen, Marcus said, his voice firm with conviction. Tell him that if he does this, he will have my full protection. He will be a hero to this city. Chen nodded, a look of relief on his face. He'll do it. He just needed to know someone at the top finally had his back. One more thing, Detective, Marcus said. Chief Reynolds. What's his role in this? Chen's expression darkened. Reynolds knows all of it. He's not stupid. He just doesn't care. His philosophy is let the street cops be street cops. He sees guys like Miller as effective because they make a lot of arrests, even if half of them are junk. It looks good on the weekly stats he sends to City Hall. Complaints, lawsuits. That's just the cost of doing business, in his mind. As long as it doesn't blow up into a big public scandal, he buries it. He's the one who signs off on the IA findings that exonerate guys like Miller. He's the enabler-in-chief. The final piece. Miller was the weapon. Davis was the shield. Reynolds was the hand that allowed it all to happen. To take down the system, he had to take down all three. Thank you, Detective Chen, Marcus said, standing up. You've done the right thing. I just want to be able to be proud of the uniform I wear, Commissioner, Chen said. A lot of us do. That night, Marcus received a secure, encrypted link from an anonymous email address. He downloaded the file. It was massive. Terabytes of data. He sat at his dining room table, which now looked like a command center, and began to watch. It was like staring into the abyss. Hour after hour of footage. He watched Officer Miller pull over a car full of teenagers because their music was too loud. He watched him order them out of the car, search them, and find nothing. He watched him berate a woman for jaywalking, his voice dripping with condescension. He watched him in dozens of encounters, and the pattern was sickeningly clear. Any person of color, any young person, anyone who looked like they wouldn't or couldn't fight back, was a target. Anyone who questioned his authority, even politely, was met with instant, aggressive hostility. And then he cross-referenced the videos with Sergeant Davis's digital reports. Just as Chun had said, for every video showing a clear violation of policy, a clear abuse of power, there was a supervisory report from Davis with the same lazy, exonerating phrase. Action consistent with department policy, it was a conspiracy of indifference, a digital paper trail of neglect. He worked for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, fueled by coffee and a cold, burning rage. Elena would bring him food, put a hand on his good shoulder, and watch him for a moment, her face a mixture of pride and worry. He was not just a man seeking justice for himself. He was an avatar for every person in those videos, every name in Clara's files. He found the smoking gun on the 4th day. It was footage from 6 months prior. Miller had arrested a young man for disorderly conduct after the man had tried to film him harassing a homeless person. The arrest was violent and completely unjustified. The young man filed a complaint. The case went to Internal Affairs. Marcus found the IA file. It contained a sworn statement from Miller, co-signed by Davis, claiming the young man had assaulted him and that the use of force was necessary. A clear lie, contradicted by Miller's own body camera. But the IA report concluded that Miller was exonerated. And at the bottom of the report was a handwritten note from Chief Reynolds to the head of IA. It said, "Make this go away. Miller's a good cop. The kid is a known troublemaker. Bury it. Bury it." Marcus printed the note. He printed Miller and Davis's false statement. He isolated the video clip that showed the truth. He had it all: conspiracy to file a false report, obstruction of justice, perjury, and it went all the way to the top. He then called Sarah Jenkins, the journalism student. "Sarah, it's Marcus Thorne. How are you?" "I'm good, sir. A little anxious. I still have the video." "I know, and I'm grateful. Now, I have another favor to ask. A bigger one. I'm going to send you a file. It's a compilation of evidence. Other videos. Documents. I want you to look at it. As a journalist. And I want you to be prepared to write the story of your life." He spent the next week packaging the evidence. He worked like the prosecutor he was, building an airtight case. He created a separate file for each charge, for each individual. He cross-referenced Clara's files with the body cam footage and the official reports, showing a decade-long pattern of behavior. He wrote a clear, damning narrative, supported by unimpeachable evidence. He presented it to Mayor Rossi on a Friday afternoon, exactly 12 days after the incident. He had 9 days of leave remaining. They met in her office, high above the city. She read through the summary he had prepared, her face growing grimmer with every page. When she was finished, she looked up at him. "My God, Marcus. It's worse than I ever imagined. It's the machine," he said, "working exactly as it was designed to. It exhausts people into submission. But they can't exhaust this." He tapped the thick binder of evidence on her desk. "What's the plan?" she asked. "The plan is a systemic decapitation," Marcus said, his voice cold and precise. "On Monday morning, you are going to call an emergency press conference. You will announce that based on evidence uncovered in an ongoing investigation, you have asked the U.S. Attorney's Office to open a federal civil rights investigation into the Northwood Police Department, focused on a pattern and practice of misconduct. That will be a political firestorm," she said. "Let it burn," Marcus replied. "At the same time, arrest warrants will be served. For Officer Miller and Sergeant Davis. Not for departmental violations. For felony assault, conspiracy, and filing a false report related to my arrest. And for a dozen other incidents we can now prove. And then, a third warrant. For Chief Frank Reynolds. For obstruction of justice and conspiracy." The mayor stared at him, her eyes wide. "Arrest the chief of police." "He's a criminal who happens to be a chief of police," Marcus corrected her. "We treat him as such. We hold him accountable. Publicly. Dramatically. We send a message that no one is above the law. Not the cop on the beat, not his supervisor, and not the man in the corner office." "And the story?" she asked. "The press will be handled," Marcus said. "At the exact moment the first handcuffs go on, Sarah Jenkins's story will be published on the Northwood State Journalism School's website. It will include the video of my arrest and select clips from the other videos. It will contain quotes from the victims and Clara's files. It will lay out the entire conspiracy. We're not just going to win. We're going to control the narrative from start to finish." The mayor leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated admiration. "You are not at all what I thought I was getting when I appointed you, Marcus Thorne. You were getting a new police commissioner," he said. "What you're getting is a new police department." The morning of the reckoning broke, clear and cold. 8 days of leave remaining. Marcus was up at 5:30 a.m., as always. He stood by the window, drinking his coffee, watching the sky lighten. Today was the day the machine would be broken. At 9 a.m. sharp, 2 unmarked cars from the state police, chosen specifically to avoid using Northwood officers, pulled up to a modest suburban house. Officer Miller, on administrative leave, was mowing his lawn. He looked up, annoyed, as the plainclothes officers got out of their car. He recognized one of them from the academy. "Hey, Jeff," Miller said, cutting the engine on his mower. "What's up? Here to tell me I can come back to work." The state officer's face was grim. "David Miller, you are under arrest for felony assault, conspiracy to file a false report, and multiple violations of the color of law." He produced a pair of handcuffs, the same kind Miller had used on Marcus. Miller's face went from cocky to confused to terrified in the space of 3 seconds. "What? This is a joke. This is about that guy at the diner? My union rep said this was all going to blow over." Your union rep can meet you at the county jail, the officer said, taking Miller's arm and placing it behind his back. The procedure was by the book, professional, devoid of the unnecessary brutality Miller himself had favored. The irony was palpable. He was being led away in the same manner he had imposed on so many others, his neighbors watching from their windows. At the same time, a second team arrived at Sergeant Davis's home. He was in his garage, working on an old car. When he saw the officers, he didn't even protest. The weary resignation he had worn for years finally settled over him completely. He put his hands behind his back and allowed himself to be cuffed. He knew the game was over. The biggest prize was last. At 9:15 a.m., two senior investigators from the state attorney general's office walked into the 17th Precinct headquarters. They walked past the front desk, ignoring the salutes from the younger officers, and went straight to the top floor. They didn't knock on Chief Reynolds' door. They opened it and walked in. Reynolds was on the phone, yelling at someone, probably a union lawyer. He looked up, startled. "What is this?" "I'm in a meeting." Frank Reynolds, the lead investigator, said, his voice booming in the large office. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Reynolds stared at them, his face turning a blotchy red. "You can't do this. I am the chief of police of this city." "Not anymore. You're not," the investigator said. He walked around the desk. Reynolds, for the first time in his career, looked small and powerless. He was escorted from his office, past the stunned faces of his command staff, and walked through the very precinct he had run for 2 decades. They didn't take him out the back. They walked him out the front door, in full view of the press that had, as if by magic, just begun to assemble. At that exact moment, Mayor Rossi stepped up to the podium at City Hall, and on 1,000 phones and computer screens across the city, Sarah Jenkins's story went live. The headline was simple and devastating. "The Machine: How a Decade of Police Corruption and Cover UPS led to the Arrest of Northwood's Top Cop." The article was a masterpiece of prosecutorial journalism. It had the video of Marcus's arrest, playing on a loop. It had clips of Miller's other abuses. It had photos of the internal documents, including Reynolds's handwritten "bury it" note. It had quotes from Clara Peterson and a half-dozen other victims who were finally ready to speak on the record. It was a complete and total demolition. The mayor's press conference was brief and brutal. She announced the arrests. She announced that she had formally requested a federal pattern and practice investigation. She announced that she was appointing an interim chief from outside the department. She didn't mince words. She called it a cancer. She promised to cut it out, no matter how deep it went. Marcus watched it all on TV from his home office. He felt no joy, no triumph, just a quiet, grim satisfaction. The feeling of a difficult, necessary job well done. The first phase was complete. The public reckoning was underway. The system that had protected these men had been turned against them with devastating precision. The next phase would be even harder, rebuilding from the ashes. The swearing-in ceremony was held a week later, on the steps of City Hall. Marcus Thorne, his arm no longer in a sling, stood with his right hand raised, his left hand on a Bible held by Elena. He wore a simple, dark suit. His face was calm, resolute. He recited the oath of office, his voice steady and clear, echoing across the plaza packed with citizens, reporters, and police officers. Many of the officers looked on with uncertainty, even fear. Others, like Detective Chun, who stood in the back, looked on with a nascent hope. After the oath, Marcus stepped to the podium. He did not deliver a soaring speech. His words were simple, direct, and promised not miracles, but work. "Today is not an end," he began. "It is a beginning. The events of the past few weeks have laid bare a deep and painful breach of trust between the police department and the community it is sworn to serve. That trust is broken, and words alone cannot repair it." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces. "Repair begins with accountability, and it continues with reform. My first act as your police commissioner is to announce the formation of a new, independent civilian oversight board. It will have the power to investigate all citizen complaints, to subpoena documents and body camera footage, and to recommend disciplinary action. It will be a board made of the community, for the community." He paused, letting the weight of that announcement sink in. "The first person I have asked to serve on this board, and who has accepted, is Mrs. Clara Peterson of the Oakhaven Diner. A ripple of applause started in the crowd and grew into a wave. In the front row, Clara, dressed in her Sunday best, stood and gave a small, dignified nod. "We will rebuild this department on a new foundation," Marcus continued. "A foundation of respect, transparency, and true public service. The era of the machine is over. The era of the people has begun. Now, let's get to work." He stepped back from the podium. The applause was thunderous. A few days later, on a quiet Saturday morning, Marcus got into his Mustang. It was the last of his 21 days of leave. Tomorrow, he would walk into the commissioner's office for the first time. But today, he had one last stop to make. He drove to Oakhaven. He parked in the same spot across from the diner. He got out of the car. The morning sun was warm on the brick wall where Officer Miller had slammed him. He ran his uninjured hand over the rough surface. A scar on the building. A scar on the city. But scars could heal. He crossed the street and went inside. The diner was busy, buzzing with the happy noise of a Saturday morning. He took his usual stool, the third one from the end. Clara saw him and smiled, a real, warm smile. "Morning, Commissioner," she said, her voice full of a new lightness. "The usual?" "Morning, Clara," he said, the title still feeling foreign. "Yes, ma'am. The usual." She placed the heavy white mug in front of him and filled it with coffee. It smelled of home, of justice, of a new day. He wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling its warmth seep into his skin. He looked out the window at the street, at the people walking by, at the city he was now sworn to protect. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, on the corner of Elm and 3rd, there was peace. A reflective peace. The quiet before the good work began. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.